All right, guys, what's going on? Back again. iCoach Nutrition VIP members. We've talked about this before, but these will be translated into the new podcast launching soon as well. But guys, today I have a very special guest. We were in Miami Beach this last weekend, living it up. Well, really working it up, I would say. But guys, Mr. Mike Millner, how are you, my man?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on. It's kind of like a reality check getting back to the cold weather, but it was a nice weekend down there for sure.
I know, man. I mean, not that Dallas is like that cold, but I got off the plane and it was like 30 degrees and I had like shorts on and I was like, oh my God, I'm freezing.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't realize there was like snow on the ground here, when I landed in Philly, and I was like, oh, I'm not ready for this right now.
Yeah. Oh my God. I couldn't even imagine going back to snow. Well, cool, man. So tell the listeners a little bit about you. Like, I obviously, they probably know that, we're like in the same mastermind group and we're kind of in the same space in terms of like online coaching. But tell us a little bit more about you and your company and kind of just how you got into this whole crazy world of health and fitness.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess the best place to start is like, I grew up as an athlete my whole life. So it was more just like sports focused. I never really did anything with strength training or weightlifting. Really just focused on getting better at sports. Like, I played basketball, I played tennis, I played soccer. So I was just kind of focused on that all the way through college. Never really had to worry about what I was eating or what I was doing for, training. I was just happy being an athlete. And, I kind of picked up some habits through college, as we tend to do, that, were more drinking than I'd like and eating less than ideal foods. And once organized sports stopped, it was kind of like the first time in my life what felt like overnight I had gained a ton of weight. And it was, obviously it was a process, but, for me to not really have any awareness around that, it legitimately felt like I just woke up one day and I didn't even recognize myself. So, just for reference, at my heaviest, I was probably about 250 pounds. And I spent like my entire high school and college life at, 170, 180. So it was a pretty significant, kind of transformation in a direction that I wasn't comfortable with. And that kind of led me down pretty much what a lot of people experience. Like, how do I never had to pay attention to nutrition. I never had to like really think about what type of workouts to do. And I just went through like all of the typical crash dieting, cardio my ass off. Like, how can I get this weight off as quickly as possible? I didn't care about doing it the right way. I didn't even know what the right way was. So it was just, let's jump on, the treadmill for an hour. Let's, do as much cardio as possible and start cutting food. And that led down, a whole series of yo-yo dieting. I would drop down to like 200 and then I'd bounce back up and then I'd hit it again and drop down again and bounce back up. And it was just such a frustrating thing for me to like not be able to figure it out and understand like why what I was doing wasn't working. And so that led me down just like wanting to educate myself. And so I started going, like my first time ever doing like an organized, gym type of workout was actually like a boot camp class. I found this local gym near me, and that was like the first time that I really got into any form of weight training. And it just kind of stuck. Like I could see progressions in myself. Like, this one class I used 40-pound dumbbells, and then the next class I used 45, and it was actually something that I could see progress again. And so, that was the positive of that experience. The negative of that experience was that I got put on like my first ever true nutrition plan that was like, here's how you track macros and here's your how you count calories. And it was like a 1,600 calorie diet. It was very aggressive, and like that led me down the path of, just feeling like shit, knowing that something wasn't right, but I was losing weight. So I'm like, all right, well, I just need to like white knuckle my way through this. And I would just get frustrated because I would have like a weekend where I would let up a little bit, or I would go on vacation. And then I felt like all that hard work was gone in such a short period of time. And so that's really what got me passionate about learning and like wanting to put out information that is actually, applicable to real life situations and not just here's the fastest way to do this. And, it's not exciting to think about doing it the right way. But it just, because of my personal experience, I felt like that was the only way to go. Like I really wanted to educate myself first and then obviously pass that information on to others who I know are going through similar struggles that I went through. So anything that I can do to help kind of avoid some of those pitfalls and those setbacks and the frustration, I wanted to be able to do that. And so that got me into nutrition coaching, where I started working for another company and was, one of the head coaches there. And it was a good experience. And then, I just didn't totally agree with their philosophy. So about 6 months ago or 5 months ago, I linked up with Jason Phillips and started my own company. So now I own Peak Optimization Performance. And it's really something that's just, a personal thing for me because of my own journey. And then, also wanting to take individualized coaching to that level of, truly understanding each individual from a physiological level and then from a psychological level. So that's something like understanding the way people are wired and different personality types. And I know that's something that we'll get into, but that's something that really resonated with me throughout my journey of finding, what works best for myself and understanding that what works for me isn't going to work for the next person. And so it's really about understanding the individual, how our personalities impact our training and nutrition. And that's kind of the long-winded answer of what got me to where I am today.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, I mean, obviously, you and I and a lot of other coaches kind of like in our little group, if you will, a lot of us, like we talk about kind of this individualized coaching model. And I think that's where a lot of kind of the industry is moving into now. It's just the little cookie cutter templates and things just don't work anymore. So I'm glad to hear that there's other people, in the space that have that same philosophy as well. And obviously, like your identity, your experience has been shaped by all of these different things up to this point. So it's really cool. So what sports, just kind of diving into a little bit more of your past, like what sports did you play, like kind of growing up?
Yeah, so I was like one of those kids that just wanted to play anything. So when I was younger, it was like, basketball, baseball, soccer, tennis, pretty much anything. Then when I, in high school, I kind of had to, pick for 3 seasons. So I stopped playing baseball then, and it was really focused on basketball, soccer, and tennis. Tennis was the sport that I actually like excelled the most at. I was playing tournaments locally, and I was like ranked in the Philadelphia area. It wasn't like the sport I was the most passionate about. That was probably more basketball for me. But then when I got to college, I still played. I went to University of Maryland, so I couldn't quite play at that level for basketball, but I would play in like, all of the intramural leagues. I played, football, soccer, and all the intramural leagues at Maryland. And yeah, so that was just something for me that once that organized sport ended, it was like a whole new world that I kind of had to discover.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, so I want to dive into this whole conversation. Obviously you kind of mentioned on like personality types and you mentioned, well, I don't know if you threw it out there, but like neurotypes. And so this whole concept of like neurotype training, for everybody that's watching, like I honestly had never really heard of this before. Like you were somebody that introduced it to me when I first met you back in like Vegas, I think. So as we were talking before, I'm just super interested to kind of learn more about it, but can you just kind of give us like the overview, like what is this whole like neurotype training? What is that?
Yeah. So when you say like, your neurotype or your personality profile or your neurological profile, they're all like interchangeable. Basically, we get insight into like kind of your brain chemistry by knowing things about your personality. And this goes back like all the way. There was a psychologist, Dr. Braverman, and like if anybody has ever done like a job interview where you have to take a personality assessment, it's likely one of his, or there's like another model that was the Cloninger model, but usually it's one of those two. And basically they figured out that like when we have insight into personality traits about somebody, we can actually make assumptions about the neurotransmitter balance in their body. So kind of like the way that you're wired. And neurotransmitters are basically just messengers sent from the brain that basically carry a message to different parts depending on the situation or context. But most people are familiar with like, dopamine, adrenaline, serotonin. Those are all just different neurotransmitters that play different roles. But when we have a sense of your personality, we get insight into the neurotransmitter balance in your body. And that plays a huge role into what you're going to enjoy most when it comes to training, what, will be optimal as far as like the style of training that you'll just gravitate towards. And then as far as like getting results, there are certain things that, we need to be aware of when it comes to programming for different personality types. So there's 5 different personality profiles. And basically it's looking at what are the strengths and weaknesses of each profile. And then how can we kind of, program and optimize a training protocol to fit that personality type, to work with your nature, the way that you're wired, so that you're naturally going to enjoy the training more, and also see better results from, the work that you're putting in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, and it just makes me think, kind of going back to your story, like, what if you would have known about this whole neurotype thing throughout your journey? Like, you probably would have been able to identify and like figure this out a little bit sooner along the way.
Yeah, for sure. And I was like the classic, and as we get into the different neurotypes, like you'll understand, but I was the classic like program hopper. I couldn't stick with one program. Like I would be the person, I would look up, like I would literally like Google like what is the best training program, like find something and be like, okay, this, Google says this is the best training program, so I'm going to do that. And I would do it for like 3 weeks. I wouldn't see the result that I was expecting, and be like, all right, well, I'm going to move on to the next thing. And I always thought there was something wrong with me. Like, why can't I stick through one program and actually see it through? And it's just the way that I'm wired. So like my basically personality type is somebody that needs variation. Like I thrive on variety. So when it comes to programming for somebody like me, there's a way to keep things fresh, to keep that variety in place, but also to have a logical progression through that, so that you wouldn't get bored. You'd be able to mix things up, whether it's through, different exercise variations or different intensity methods or just different, training blocks. And it, just takes a little bit of understanding the way that you're wired and that need for variation, and then programming accordingly. So yeah, if I had known that before, it would have saved me, years of like frustration and not understanding, and like, not being able to figure out why I couldn't stick with one program for very long.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I mean, I think a lot of people's little light bulb is going off in their head right now, right? Because there's a lot of people that have been struggling with like finding something that works for them. So I'm intrigued, man. Let's dive into it. So what are the different neurotypes? How do they break this all down?
Yeah. So, there's 5 profiles. And so you have, your type 1s, and then there's a subgroup of type 1. So you have type 1A and type 1B. And type 1s are dopamine dominant. And, basically dopamine is the neurotransmitter that's kind of like that reward center. So it will be amplified anytime like you have a thrill seeking activity, you'll get a spike in dopamine. Or even when you're doing like heavy training, if you're lifting a really heavy weight, you're going to get a dopamine spike. Or, even something like, gambling, or riding a motorcycle really fast, or jumping out of an airplane, like all that stuff, you think of as like the thrill response, the reward response. Even from like, food, it can spike dopamine. Like if you have a treat, like a cookie or a donut or whatever, something like that.
Like
So
we got in Miami Beach.
exactly what I was thinking of. Definitely. So, and that's kind of why like some people tend to think that they have, addiction, or, a food addiction specifically with sugary foods, because it does kind of trigger that reward center of the brain. And so it's like you remember that feeling, and then you want more of that. So type 1s are dopamine dominant. They actually have low levels of dopamine at baseline. So at rest, their dopamine levels are low, but they're highly sensitive to it. So they don't need to produce as much as somebody else to get that same response, which is why they are more risk takers. They like the thrill seeking activities. They like to, basically lift really heavy weights because they're highly sensitive to any increase in dopamine. They don't need very much of it to get the same response. So like a type 1A, some of their personality traits, they're going to be really extroverted, very confident, kind of like confrontational. Like they want to convince you that they're right. They like to argue. They walk into a room and they just want to own it. They want to be the leader. And all of that is kind of based off of the way that they're kind of wired. And then when it comes to training, because of that, we want to keep their intensity really high to get that dopamine spike that they're craving. So an example would be like a power lifter doing very low reps, but very high weight. So they can touch like 90% intensity per session, but we have to keep in mind that we don't want to crash or deplete their dopamine. So we have to keep the volume per session moderate to low and allow them enough, to recover. So we're not causing, a depletion of dopamine. And that's just something like when you're programming or when I'm programming for a type 1A, that we have to keep in mind. Like the strength for them is that they can touch very high intensity. The weakness for them is that they're so competitive and they're like this burn the candle at both ends type of personality that they tend to do too much. So then knowing the strengths and weaknesses, then we can kind of balance out what that training protocol would look like. And then
for any of you CrossFitters out there, that one probably resonated with you because we all know how CrossFitters are.
Yeah, exactly. It's like all right, well, I'm going to do one more rep because he did one more rep, and you just get into that competitive drive. And you can end up, feeling like day because you're crashing your CNS, you're depleting that dopamine, and and it's tough to recover after that. And so then the type 1Bs, they're also dopamine dominant. So they have some similar traits in that they're also extroverted. They're very confident. They're not as competitive. They are competitive, but not as competitive as a type 1A. But the main difference with them is they have high levels of acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter that's responsible for motor learning, short-term memory. So they're very sharp with being able to multitask. They can pick up complicated things very quickly. So, showing them a very technical lift, the type 1B will be able to pick it up like in an instant. You don't have to, coach them very much. They're just naturally gifted, naturally athletic. And so, for them, they're very imaginative. They like to, because of the high levels of acetylcholine, they need kind of their brain to always be working. So they're super impatient. They hate to wait. Like they want to see results right away. They want to basically, be able to multitask and do certain things that are going to keep their brain active. And so when it comes to training, that's explosive lifting, more technical movements, Olympic lifting, even like some CrossFit style. And then, supersets so that they're not getting bored. Like if they're doing a straight set with a long rest, they're going to get bored. They want to keep their mind working. So, doing more supersets and keeping rest periods a little bit shorter. And so those are, kind of the considerations for a type 1B. And then as we go into the type 2s, type 2A, which is my neurotype, we're adrenaline dominant. And so again, we have low levels of adrenaline at rest, but we're highly sensitive to it. And so type 2A is, it's almost like two different personalities, because when adrenaline's low, adrenaline's responsible for like your perceived confidence, your perceived strength. It's going to increase blood flow and muscle contraction. So when adrenaline's low at rest, you're going to be more introverted. You're going to be more insecure, lack confidence. So, if you ever see me in like a situation where I'm just like lounging around, I'm not going to talk very much. I'm going to be more quiet, more reserved. But then once I get that spike in adrenaline, because we're highly sensitive to it, all of a sudden we become more extroverted, more talkative, more confident. So like anything, once you're in the gym, that adrenaline gets going, or even if like you're out, at a party or at a bar, or whatever the case may be, where you do feel that increase in adrenaline, type 2As are going to kind of come out of their shell, so to speak. And they're people pleasers. So type 2As kind of, can adapt to really any situation. And it's, sometimes it can come across as like fake because they'll like mold their personality based off of who they're talking to, but it's really like a defense mechanism because they want to be admired and liked by everyone. And so they can kind of mold to whatever situation they're in. And they thrive on variety. So, that's like my whole issue was program hopping, like training ADD. I couldn't stick with one thing. So that's typical of a type 2A. They need variation. We want to keep their adrenaline high during training. So very short rest periods, supersets, mixing up the exercise protocol, mixing up the intensity methods. The thing with a type 2A is that everything works, but nothing works for very long. So they can almost do every single style of training, but they just can't do it for an extended period of time. That's pretty much when you're talking about the type 2As, some of the things you have to consider is that need for variation when you're programming. And then, moving on to the type 2Bs, the biggest thing with a type 2B is they have very high levels of glutamate. And glutamate is a neurotransmitter that's an emotional amplifier. And so type 2Bs are just very emotional in general. So if you think of glutamate, regardless of what emotion you're feeling, glutamate's going to amplify that. So that can be a positive, like their highs are going to be very high, or it can be a negative, as in their lows are going to be very low. So they're like the most prone to emotional eating or binge eating because, they produce very high levels of glutamate. And they really love to feel. So emotion, sensation, they want to feel their muscles working. So when it comes to training, more bodybuilding style of work, they don't do well with like really heavy lifting. They do much better with high reps, low weight, pump work, feel those muscles working, mind muscle connection. That's really going to be important for a type 2B. And then lastly, you have a type 3, which they're serotonin dominant. So they actually have very low levels of serotonin. Serotonin is the neurotransmitter that's basically like your sense of well-being, of comfort. So it brings you down from being overly anxious. And because they have very low levels, they are more anxious most of the time. And so they're like your planners. They need everything to be planned out as far out in advance as possible. So they're like kind of typical endurance runners. They can do, some form of heavy lifting, but they have to master the movement. They have to be very comfortable with the movement. So they're like technique geeks. Like they want to know exactly what they're doing before they'll increase the weight. And so that's, typical for a type 3 is just, more control, more mastery of movement, and then, planning well out in advance. So that kind of gives you a breakdown of the 5 types.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Have you ever, this question just kind of came to me, like, have you ever thought about like kind of, I know they break it down into like, I don't even know what to call it, like superheroes for like each neurotype type of thing, like,
Yeah.
And then maybe even correlate it to like maybe like careers. Have you ever tried, like, do you see any correlation amongst the different neurotypes and like the different like population types?
Yeah, for sure. So like type 1As, like you would be more of like your car salesman. Like they love to just convince you that they're right, and they're like, or politician type of people. Type 1B would be more of like your lawyers, where, they like to argue, but it's more like logical. It's less emotion. It's more like, here are the facts, and they like to argue their case, and they're just kind of naturally confident without being like abrasive, like a type 1A. Type 2As, they're people pleasers. So like teachers, is a perfect role for a type 2A. Type 2B, you would see more of like your psychologist. They love to connect one-on-one with people. They can empathize with emotion. And then the type 3s would be more of like your accountants. Like it's like very structured, very organized. They're, it's not like where something would come up last minute that throws them a curveball. Like they don't like the unknown. So, planners, organizers, like an accountant. So yeah. And then, I actually did like an Instagram series on comparing each neurotype to superheroes. And I don't remember off the top of my head what each one was, but there's definitely characteristics of each that you can kind of like pair through when you think about that.
Nice. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out, I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, well, what am I almost feel like, I don't know. There's like certain things in each one. Like
Yeah.
when you went over like 1A and 1B, like, I don't know. I'm trying to figure it out.
Yeah, so that's funny. Everybody has that initial response. And they're like, well, certain traits made sense for this one, and then certain traits made sense for this one. And that's totally normal because if you think about it, we have the way that we're wired. We have like kind of our brain chemistry, but then we also have years of learned experience, and that's going to impact what you resonate with. So an example would be like, let's say you have a type 1A. They're very much like, they don't like authority. They kind of like to do their own thing. Um, you know, they're just kind of free spirited. But then let's say you had a type 1A who like joined the military where things were very structured. That's more of a type 3 trait. But if they went, through military training for years and years and years, they're going to resonate with some of those characteristics, even though it's not the way that they're wired. So learned experience will have, play a part. So I like to think that, when it comes to your dominant neurotype, you'll probably hit about 60 to 70% of the characteristics, and then the rest will be based off of your life experience.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm interested to learn, like, how has your like neurotype kind of changed like throughout your life, or maybe not changed, but like, or maybe has it changed throughout your life, or is there just like different characteristics that maybe you've noticed as you've like gotten older? Or?
Yeah, so that's the biggest thing. Like your dominant profile is that's your personality type, basically for life. Now, there are certain situations where you'll kind of take on traits of another neurotype, which if you're under a significant amount of stress, for me, you kind of will default to like your secondary profile. Or like for me, when I'm under a lot of stress, I tend to act more like a 2B than I do a 2A. So I'm more emotional. And it's funny because my training will fit that too. Like I noticed that when stress is high in my life, I just gravitate towards bodybuilding style of training. And it's just kind of a natural thing, but it makes sense because, that's like my secondary, when stress is high, I kind of default to that profile. And so, but I think the biggest thing about is, and why, I like to kind of teach about, personality types and how it impacts your life is it's just that level of self-awareness. And so and it's helped me with, relationships, and it's helped me in my career, and just understanding why I respond certain ways in certain situations. Having that self-awareness allows me to know, like, there's nothing wrong with me. This is just how I'm wired. And now that I have that information, I can kind of adapt and change the way that I would normally respond if it's unfavorable. So I look at kind of like, the weaknesses of like a type 2A, because, we're people pleasers. We want to make sure that everybody's happy, but sometimes that means that we don't say no when we really want to. And that's something like being aware of that. Then I can assess and be like, okay, am I just people pleasing right now? Is this something that I really want to do? Or, should I just say no? And like, I have to, that level of self-awareness has helped me, in situations like that, where I can see my personality kind of taking control of like, maybe I'm doing something I don't really want to do. And, just helps me kind of make better decisions and kind of navigate those situations, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree. I mean, it's funny, like the more and more I learn about it, like all the similarities, and like what we do too. I mean, if you think about like, I mean, obviously we were there that weekend with like the whole identity mapping process. And then like, I mean, just thinking to yourself that like from the day that we set step on this earth, right? Like from the day that we were born, like every last thing that's happened to us in our life, like up to this point, has like impacted us. And it's influenced and basically, built up our identity, our neurotype, whatever. So I just think it's so interesting. Have you tried to dive in, or maybe this is something you do, but have you dived into like the nutritional, so like the neurotype, this is kind of more of like the training side of it, but is there like specific kind of like nutritional protocols or characteristics for each neurotype as well, or how does that work?
Yeah, for sure. So there's going to be stuff that, is important when it comes to understanding each profile and how they'll respond to a nutritional protocol. But I always kind of preface that by saying like the context of your life is most important. So even though there's certain things that like a type 1A would respond better to, there's still individual variance there. And obviously we know that adherence is the most important thing and consistency. So just because I can say that from a neurotransmitter standpoint, from a psychological standpoint, like this should be the best approach for type 1A, that doesn't mean that that would apply to each individual that falls within that neurotype, if that makes sense. So, but just as like more of a broad overview, type 1As, because based off of how their neurotransmitter balance looks, they have high levels of serotonin, which means they don't need a lot of carbs to see results, because they're gonna be able to come down from their training more efficiently. They're going to be like one of the only neurotypes they can handle a lot of stress. So we don't, carbs increase serotonin, but they already have a high level of serotonin. So a type 1A, plus it fits with their personality of being competitive. So they want to see results. So let's say, a type 1A has a goal of fat loss. If you put them on a very conservative plan, they're not going to buy in if they don't see result right away. And they can actually handle lower carbs because they already have high levels of serotonin. So that's just one of the things, like with a type 1A, they're like one of the only neurotypes that can actually build muscle on pretty low to moderate carbs. And so that's one of like the strengths of their neurotype that you would play to when you were doing a nutrition prescription. Same thing with a type 1B, very similar. They have higher levels of, so they have high levels of acetylcholine, but they also have high levels of serotonin and GABA. And GABA is just another neurotransmitter that kind of brings you down. So the way that I like to describe it is like serotonin is like your brake pedal on your car, because you can kind of modulate it based off of how much you need to slow down. So if you're really amped up, you can step on the brake pedal harder, but if you're only a little bit amped up, you can step on it a little bit lighter. And that's kind of serotonin's role. GABA is like the emergency brake. That's like on or off. And so they do work hand in hand as like a mood regulator. But for a type 1B, it's kind of a similar approach. They need to see results right away. But they're also, because of their high levels of acetylcholine, they like for their brain to be working. So for them, if you give them like one set of macros and you're like, here, go do this, they're going to get bored with it. So kind of doing some carb cycling, or just, maybe like a non-training training day, just to give them something different to think about and keep their mind working. They like to, try to multitask and feel like they can accomplish a lot. You can throw a lot at them at once. And then they also like to see results quickly and can handle a little bit lower carbs. So then when you look at a type 2A, variety is key for them. So, switching things up, they can do really anything, as far as, high carb, low fat, low carb, high fat. It's just that variation. And then, trying to match that up with, what their goal is, what their training looks like at that time. But the variety is going to be the thing that keeps them interested. So, you kind of have everything at your disposal when it comes to a type 2A. You just want to make sure that, there's a reason for that. You can, keep the progression in mind, but also find kind of creative ways. So like one thing that I'll do with type 2As is I'll have them just like alternate different foods, and like get them to try a different protein source or carb source like each week, and see if that can like keep them engaged and, enjoying different variations of food types. And then, making changes to kind of their macro prescription, keep the variety in there. Type 2Bs, they're interesting because they don't make the conversion from glutamate to GABA very efficiently. So as I said, like GABA kind of helps calm you down, and glutamate is that emotional amplifier. Because they don't make the conversion efficiently, they tend to be more anxious. So they do need a little bit more carbs, but you have to kind of be strategic about it. So I like kind of the typical bodybuilder style of diet for them, where we put a lot of carbs around training when we know that they're going to use them a little bit more efficiently, and then, just go with like more protein and fats at their other meals. And so it's pretty straightforward. But the thing with them is we have to keep in mind that they're more likely to binge or emotionally eat. And so that's kind of the stuff with the type 2B. I do mindset work with all of my clients, but type 2Bs especially, we need to know that, they're more likely to have an emotional response with food as the outlet. So coming up with different strategies to help them with that, and understand, that might be something that we just need to plan for. And then with the type 3s, you know, they're tricky because they have very low levels of serotonin. So they're high stress, high anxiety. So they produce more cortisol. So when they, you know, people who overproduce cortisol, they need carbs to increase serotonin to help shut off that cortisol response. But they're also more insulin resistant or more prone to insulin resistance. So it's kind of a balancing act. So with the type 3, you know, more moderate carbs, but I like to keep it like small servings of carbs throughout the day. So that way we're kind of helping manage the higher cortisol, but we're not overfeeding them carbs in any one meal where, you know, we're going to get a huge insulin response. And then if they already have some insulin resistance, then obviously that's not going to be favorable. So they have a little bit of a challenge with, you know, body composition. They tend to have more of like the endurance style of body where it's almost like the skinny fat look. But there's ways to kind of work around that, like I said, with specific carb timing and then how much carbs you're giving them around training. And so, yeah, there's like certain things when it comes to, let's look at the neurotransmitter balance and the hormonal response, because, you know, a lot of people don't realize, but the relationship between did I lose you?
There we are. You're back. That was weird. You like cut out right there. Yeah, that was really weird. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I got you now. Yeah, it looked like it just froze for a second.
It was right when you started talking about like the hormonal component is when I lost.
Okay. Yeah, basically it's just that neurotransmitters and hormones are interconnected and you can't like separate the two. They kind of work synergistically in a lot of ways. And so we kind of look at that and then, you know, try and make sure that the nutrition protocol will help kind of balance that out with depending on what the personality profile is.
Got it. So how like let's say for instance, like we identify, you know, this neurotype for somebody and we start off and maybe we're programming in this way, we're taking things into consideration. Like at what point or after like how much time, and I know obviously it depends on the individual, but like what if somebody's like, I just don't think like this is my neurotype, like I just don't think this is working. Like how do you distinguish between like them being in their own head and then just like not being like consistent because of other life things?
Yeah. And I think that's, you know, kind of the most important thing is the context of that person's life. So we don't just want to know like your personality type, but we want to know, you know, what's your relationship like? What, you know, what do you do for fun? Like what's your non-negotiables? How do you unwind? You know, what's your nighttime routine, morning routine? You know, so all of these things we can kind of then obviously looking at like biofeedback and how their body's responding and then what they're reporting. So, you know, sometimes you'll see that somebody will like check in with me and they're like going on and on about all these different stressful situations in their life. And then they're like, you know, how would you rate your stress on a scale of 1 to 5? And they're like, oh, it was a 1. I'm like, well, you had all these things happen, but yet, you know, so it's just a matter of kind of like taking the big picture and looking at the context of their life and then how their body's responding. And then, you know, if they feel like something's wrong, then obviously we need to kind of try to find the root cause of that. Like, is it just you're dealing with too many stressors in your life and we're not getting enough recovery, we're not getting enough self-care, or like, you know, just trying to work on like the mindset side of things? Or is there like a physiological, is there something going on where like digestion is off and we see that like sex drive is low and there's more of a physiological reason, and then we can kind of piece it together as to like what the root cause is and just address it from there. So like I said, like even though each neurotype will have something that they tend to do better with, it breaks down when you get to like a specific individual and, you know, the context of their life. And so that's going to be like the most important overarching theme is what does this person respond best to within the context of their life and their goals and that sort of thing.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. I love that mentality, that approach. So what are some of like, you know, obviously, you know, there's probably people that are like interested in this and like learning more about it and diving into it. What are some of like the big, like obviously you've worked with a lot of people and taken a lot of people through this. So like what are some like the biggest like feedback or takeaways that you're hearing from clients, like from those that maybe had never heard of this before and never done it in this way, and then now that those that have kind of adopted this?
Yeah, it's a good question. And like the cool part is that most of the time it has nothing to do with training or even really nutrition. Like most of the time the people are like, I thought I was just getting like a training program based on my personality, which sounded cool. Or like I thought, I was going to get this nutrition protocol based on my personality, and that sounded cool. But really it was like all the other areas of their life. It was like, I noticed that, I do this when, like, let's just say it was like, my husband goes out and he goes out with his friends, and I realized I was getting jealous and I was doing this, and you brought like understanding my personality. I understood why I was getting jealous, and I was able to kind of modify my behavior, and it improved my relationship. And there's just like so many, it's funny, like all my testimonials from clients are like, have nothing to do with training. It's most of the time, it's like this applied to every other area of my life. So it improved my relationship. It improved, my relationship with my partner or my kids, or it helped me at my job because I realized that, as a, let's say like a type 2B trying to be in a leadership role, I realized that I was kind of like letting my emotions get the best of me, or, whatever the case may be. But it's like all the other areas that it applies to, because it really truly does come down to self-awareness. Like for you to grow in any area, whether it's fitness, whether it's career, whatever the case may be, like it has to start with self-awareness. So that's really, the biggest takeaway for most people is just it enhanced that level of self-awareness that can be applicable to every other area of life.
Wow. That's crazy. I mean, right? They come to you for like nutrition and fitness, right? Like they come to us for, I joke about it all the time. I'm like, you come to us for nutrition coaching, but really what you leave with is like the mindset that's like developed along the way, and I just think it's so crazy. We've been kind of introduced to like the 4 pillars with like, Garrett White and like body, being, balance, and business. And I think it's really interesting because it's almost like people come to us for that first pillar of like body, right? And then, as we improve that and as we hit those goals, like we can expand out into these other pillars of life as well. And it all starts with body because, mentally, physically, like you have to be well equipped to be able to go attack those other areas of life.
Yeah, for sure. And you can't really separate them either. So like, the mindset is going to affect, even just like from a physiological level, like your thoughts are going to affect kind of the hormonal process that goes on, and what neurotransmitters are going to be active. And then, just being able to like pretty much when you think about health or fitness, like it has to encompass all of those things. If like one of those pillars is broken, you're not going to be able to get the result or sustain the result that you want. So like if you have, a broken relationship, or you're at a job that you hate, like those chronic stressors are going to play a huge role in your health. So it's all connected. And I totally agree. It's like if we can get them in because they're focused on one pillar, that's great. Like that's a perfect starting point. And then just gradually get them to understand the big picture and how all of these things play a role in, just their overall well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. So what are some of the, what are some tips maybe that you have for people that like, maybe maybe they were like like you at some point, like, you were an athlete your whole life. And at some point, like you put on, 50 pounds, something like that. Right. So like, what about for the people that are watching that maybe, they've been like, they're overweight, like they've been dealing with this for a while, like they've been dealing with wanting to get this weight off, and they're just struggling, and they feel like, it's like information overload on, the Dr. Google of the world. And they're just really trying to figure out like, what is it that like works best for me? And like, how can I get out of my own head and stop creating this like self-sabotage in my life?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that that's a great like place to start, is start asking yourself those questions, and trying to become like kind of that detective for yourself. I think, it's really starting with reconnecting with your body. Like I feel like if in our industry, there's so many programs where it's like, we're just trying to fit people into a box, and we never really, like, you don't really learn anything in the process. So that's great. Like, let's say you tried keto for 4 weeks and you lost a bunch of weight on that, but did you ever like really connect to how your body felt, how your energy was, how your mood was? Like, actually listening to those signals that your body is sending is going to be huge, because then you can start, and also like what you enjoy. So like, let's say you really like carbs, but you're doing keto, and you just kind of like, power through it just because you're seeing some form of weight loss on it. But what did that really teach you? Is it really applicable for the rest of your life? And I think just trying to get down to the root of, how does this make me feel? Did I notice improvements with, my performance? Was my energy better? Was my sleep better? Was my sex drive better? And like actually reconnecting with our bodies. And like, I'm a big proponent of any sort of like mindfulness practice that will get you into that present state where you can, because we're so good at ignoring those signals. We've just kind of been conditioned to go and like never take a step back and just listen. So any sort of like mindfulness practice, like, meditation, if that's not your thing, do some journaling, listen to an audio book, a podcast, practice just some deep breathing. Like, it's the most simple form of just being present, focusing on your breath. Anything that works for you, like whatever that looks like for you, to get you present and to listen to kind of what your body's telling you. That's a great place to start, because then you really know, like, if you start to connect the dots and you realize like, I don't feel very good when I eat high fat, my digestion feels off, I feel sluggish. And then you have, somebody on Dr. Google is like, high fat is the only way to go. You can start to, raise some red flags. Like, wait a minute, I know that I don't feel the best on that. And you can start to kind of answer some of those questions for yourself. And then finding a coach that you connect with. I think that's a huge thing. It's, not about who has the most information, because like you said, information is everywhere, but it's like, who can connect with you as a person. And that's really like what I look for when I'm picking a coach, is like, do I resonate with their message? Do I resonate with them as a human being? Like, I know that if I can share and be vulnerable with my coach, then they're going to be able to help me more than if I'm just trying to like pick their brain about like the science behind, intermittent fasting. It doesn't really do me much good. So that's some of the steps that I would, start to take as if I were kind of in that position, from like 7 years ago as myself.
Yeah, man, that's great advice. How long, I'm just curious, how long did it take you to hire a coach, like back then? Like, how long did you try to figure it out on your own before you decided to hire a coach?
Yeah, so I probably spent about like 2 to 3 years on my own. And then I spent more time with coaches, like bouncing around to coaches that I just knew weren't right for me. But it was the same thing. Like, I just was like, tell me what to do and I'm going to do it. I didn't actually learn anything about myself in that process. And he's like, here's 1,600 calories, go eat this every day. And I'm like, cool, done. I'm going to go do it. And like, I didn't actually learn about anything. And it wasn't somebody that, I felt connected to in any way. And so that was like, all those things are just learning experience. So I look at that and, I know a lot of people have tried a number of different diets and, rather than looking back on it and thinking like, well, I shouldn't have done that, I shouldn't have done this, just look at it as an experience and a learning opportunity, and then use that information to apply it to where you're at right now. And you're going to realize that helped, obviously, like you talked about, like shape your identity, and it's going to help us understand like what we need to do right now.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And I think you're a testimonial to that right there. Like however many years ago you were in that position that a lot of people come to us in, and now you've been able to not only transform yourself, but now you've been able to pay it forward, and here you are helping so many other people do the same. So, dude, I love it, man. I love the interview. I love learning all about neurotyping. And dude, if everybody like that's watching this, and as they watch this, is there any place that they can go to kind of dive into more info that you put out? Like obviously website, social media, all those things.
Yeah, for sure. So my website is peakoptimizationperformance.com. I know it's long-winded. There's actually a meaning behind the name. It's basically a tribute to my grandfather who passed away recently. So I wanted to have the initials POP because we called him Papa. But so it's peakoptimizationperformance.com. And then anybody who wants to follow me on Instagram, it's at coach_Mike_Millner. And then, I run Neurotype training groups 3 times a year. Unfortunately, registration for my January group just closed. But I'll be doing some cool stuff like in the meantime where, just doing some like informational videos, thinking about putting like a webinar together or like a free group, just because people love the information so much. So if anybody just like follows me on social media or, reaches out, there'll definitely be more information coming. And then, yeah, I'm hoping to get some seminars lined up and just continue to educate and put, quality information out there. So yeah, that's really the best way to get in touch.
That's awesome, man. Well, dude, Mike, thank you so much, man. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're a busy man. I know we just got back from Miami here, so I appreciate you taking the time. And dude, we'll talk soon.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me.
I'm gonna sign us off here real quick, Mike.